Welcome back to another episode of your Hope-Filled Perspective, where it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in your God-given identity. We're in the midst of a series that I'm calling the Sacred Scar Story Series. It's in conjunction with the release of my new book, Sacred Scars, Resting in God's Promise that your past is not wasted. Friend, I don't know what wound or pain or trial you've been through, but what I know is that we can't escape this world unscathed. Jesus said we will experience pain and suffering in this world. But what I've also found is that when we're willing to surrender those wounds, that pain to the hands of our redemptive God, He loves to bring beautiful sacred scars as beauty for our ashes. I'm excited to share a new guest with you today. She's new to the podcast, has not been on here before, but you are going to be delighted to meet my friend, Becky Beresford. She lives in North Carolina, so just up the road from us, and she is happily outnumbered by her husband and three wonderful boys. She's an author, a speaker, and a coach with a master's certificate in spiritual formation and discipleship from Moody Theological Seminary. She loves encouraging God's daughters to embrace Christ-centered empowerment through the truth found in the gospel. And her first book with Moody Publishers, She Believed He Could, So She Did, released just this last March. So I'm going to put all the information about Becky and her book, which I had the privilege of endorsing. I'll put all that information in the show notes that you can find at drmichelleb.com. But would you give a warm, hope-filled perspective welcome to my friend, Becky?
Hi, Michelle. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm so happy to have you here, Becky. I've wanted to have you on since we met at our agency's retreat over a year
Yes.
ago. And
Oh my
I was
goodness. Yeah.
captivated with the idea of your book because
Mm.
out there is this faulty, I'm even going to call it theology, but it's this faulty perspective that if we just believe we can do something, we can. But I love
Mhm.
the truth of your message that if we believe God can, then we can.
Mm.
But I wanted to have you on the program today. We'll have you back to talk about that message at another time. But
Mm.
as you know, we're in the midst of this Sacred Scar story series. And I wanted to have you on to ask if you would be willing to share with our listeners some kind of painful experience that you've been through that's caused either physical pain, emotional pain, relational pain, spiritual pain, grief or loss, or maybe some combination.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of all the above. So we're in for a treat. No, just
But you're
kidding.
still smiling.
I am on this because Jesus is good and he's with us in the suffering. And I feel like I would not know Jesus the way I do if it weren't for the suffering and the scars. So as I was praying about it, I was like, Lord, I could talk about this story. I'm used to talking about this one, maybe this one. But he's like, no, I want you to share the birth story of your oldest boy. And it was my entrance into motherhood, right? Something that I'd been dreaming about for a long time. My husband and I, we were freshly married and we got pregnant. And so we did all the planning. We made an 18-page birth plan. 18 pages. It's just like, oh. So, and we handed that to the staff, to the nurses when I went into labor. Well, was almost going into labor. But basically, what happened was our son was a week late. And I was like, okay, trying to do everything we could to make it happen naturally, but it wasn't happening. So we had to do Pitocin. And just to make a long story short, nothing on our birth plan happened the way that we wanted. I wanted to try to do it natural. I wanted to try, we were just trying all the things, but it became an emergency C-section where after about 25 hours of labor and then 3 hours of pushing, and I was using all the different equipment to try to get our son out, he was wedged and his vitals started to drop and my vitals started to drop. And my husband says that he saw, like when I did my final push, I was like, I'm done. And he knew that I actually wasn't even talking about like I'm done pushing. I felt like I was done. Like my life blood was going. Like this was near the end. And so it was such a blur. They brought in the people to sign away my life and that they wouldn't be in charge, if I died, if something happened to me, but I barely remember any of that. And then next thing I know, I'm on a table and it's just a complete blur. And it's the opposite of what we prayed for. It's something that, a joy, like I'm about to become a mom, but it was filled with so much fear, so much anxiety, so much like I am trying to do this, but I can't. And I don't understand, God, why you're allowing it to go down this way. And so our son was born, and I remember my husband brought him up to, this is something I do remember from it, brought his little face up to my cheek, and I said, "Hi, little boy, I'm your mommy." And he kissed my cheek, and I'm like, worth it. All
Right.
of it.
Right.
Worth it. But the story did not end there. So afterwards, I had some severe bleeding. They were even asking, "Do you want to have other children?" And I ended up getting an infection in the scar. And so they had to reopen my cut like 2 weeks later, and I had to heal from the inside out. They had to take gauze like 2 or 3 times a day and stuff me to get the infection that was deep down there out. And it hurt and it was so painful. And I was depressed. I was in postpartum and our son wasn't sleeping. And it turns out our oldest boy, is autistic. And so I had so much going through my mind, especially within those first 2 years of motherhood. And we got his diagnosis. And I heard people saying, well, C-section can cause autism. So talk about shame.
Yeah.
Just feeling this weight of, oh my gosh, God, I don't understand why this happened. Was this my fault? Could I have done more? And so the enemy just really used that in my life to make it feel like I was not a good enough mom right from the get-go. I couldn't even birth my boy naturally. But what is beautiful from it is that I can see how God even uses these dark situations to bring, first off, comfort to others. So as I would share my birth story with other people, they'd be like, "Oh my gosh, I had a really hard birth story too." Because a lot of times you see just on, of course, Facebook or socials or whatever, you see people like, "Oh, I'm a mom, yay," and it's like so much joy. But I'm like, my story was not that. It was hard. It was sadness. It was a grieving of the motherhood that I thought we were going to have. And then with a special needs diagnosis of our son, that's a whole nother level of grief. That's a totally different story. But joy as well, they're entwined. But it just was really interesting that the Lord would continually bring women into my life where we could connect on that and be like, but even in the midst of all that pain and this literal scar that I have on my body every day, that reminds me, God brought me through. It wasn't by anything I did. It was all him. And he continually shows me and I believe this is still a healing for me. So I'm still in the midst of seeing the healing play out, but I see his redemption and his faithfulness to take care of us, even in our darkest hours when we're like, "I'm done."
Right.
And he says, "I'm not done with this story yet." It just helps us lean into who Jesus really is and the full capacity of what he's able to be in our darkest hours.
I think sometimes exactly what you are describing is what makes our pain worse. And that is when we have plans, we have expectations about how things are going to go, how things should go. An 18-page birth plan had to have been pretty specific and detailed. But
Yes.
really, I can relate to that on so many levels. I did not have an 18-page birth plan, but I have had plenty of times in my life where I wanted things to go a certain way. And the pain came when my expectations for that situation were not met. And yours was complicated because not only could you not follow the carefully prescribed birth plan, but then you give birth, you realize that your son is immediately facing challenges. But then throw on top of that, Becky, what I'm hearing is some secondary pain because of the words of others that just brings shame when we are already hurting and in pain.
Yes.
But for our listeners, shame is one of those kind of nebulous words that we don't always understand what it means or what it looks like. As you're going through this and they're telling you have to have a C-section or afterwards, even now, when you look at those physical scars, which are complicated because they had to do surgery where you already had scars to deal with the infection. What did shame look like? What did it sound like in your head. Because when we are going through those darkest times, I'm convinced that's when the enemy is the fiercest because he knows we're the most vulnerable. But help our listeners get a picture of what did that shame experience sound like to you?
I agree 110%. The enemy, it was so much of the enemy's voice. I'd say like 90%. And then 10% me. And maybe like 8% me, and then other people's voices were affecting me as well. But it sounded like you can't do this. You're not enough. You're not enough to be a mother. You're not going to be able to do this well. Look at you couldn't even start it well. You're already exhausted. How are you going to do this? How are you going to take care of your son if you can't even get off of bed? How are you going to support your husband and do the calling on your life? There's just no way. You're too exhausted. You can't do it. You can't do it. It was so many, you will not, you cannot, and also you are a failure. So he's like, Satan was trying to define me. It wasn't even like we make mistakes and things happen in our life that we can control and that we can't control. The enemy takes that and makes it a description of us.
Yeah.
Not that we experienced a failure, but you yourself are a failure. You yourself are not enough. And what's interesting, what I wish I could tell Becky 13 years ago was when the enemy came at me with that, you're not enough. I can say, I wish I would have said, you are right. On my own, I am not enough. I cannot handle all of this. It is too much for me to handle. This is too hard, but my God is bigger and I'm more than enough in him. And he completes me and he's going to bring about redemption. I trust his promises in this. So I wish I would have leaned more into that, but shame just sounds like it is defining you. Your failure is defining who you are.
That is exactly the essence of shame. Shame says you are a mistake. You are a failure instead of you made a mistake or something happened to you, because frequently the enemy will shame us even when we did nothing to contribute to the situation. You had the most well laid out plan. If it was up to you, it would have been picture perfect. But the enemy comes in and says, you're a failure. You're not enough. You'll never make it. Whereas God comes in and says, no, with me, all things are possible. When you are weak, I am strong. And I can so relate to your desire to go back 13 years and talk to Becky back then and speak truth. But I think that is one aspect of the Sacred Scar stories, is that we learn through those trials. We learn through the pain. That's how God brings us to a place of understanding his character even more than we did before. You know, mountaintop experiences are wonderful. And had you had that perfect 18-page birth plan go just as you prescribed it, it would have been this great mountaintop experience. But the real truth is that fruit grows in the valleys, those dark valleys where we're like, that did not go the way it was supposed to go. But it's still not too great for God to redeem. And so over these 13 years, how has God healed that wound, the physical, the emotional, the relational, the spiritual, the grief, and the loss? How has he healed all those areas and formed a sacred scar that's now used for good?
I just have to look at my son. It actually took us about 5 years to hear him say, I love you. He's verbal, but he just, he more concentrates on objects he likes. And so the social interaction is really difficult for him. So I had to wait about 5 years to hear for the first time, I love you, Mom. But now he's 13. And last week, I was actually having a hard week. I was like snapping at the kids. I'm homeschooling right now. So that's a whole new like stepping into, okay, Jesus, I'm going to obey this. You told me to do it. I'm going to do it kind of thing. But he said something very sweet to me. He said, Mom, you're my favorite person in the world. And I was like, oh my gosh. And it was literally coinciding with the enemy trying to shame me and be like, you can't do this homeschooling thing. You're not doing a good job taking care of your son and his needs and helping him thrive. And the rest of the boys, like sometimes it is chaotic. It's meltdowns happen a lot, but in the midst of that, the enemy will step in and try to shame me. You can't. You are a failure as a mother. You're not good enough. And now I'm able to like come back a little bit more with the truth, but I have seen how God is even like to hear that come from my boy who doesn't give compliments unless he means it. rarely does it, to say, Mom, you're my favorite person. That means the Lord has used me in my weakness, in these places where I'm like, oh, I just don't know if I can do this. God comes in and shines through and shows his love, shows his ability to take care of my boys where I can't. And they still can say that to me. So it's just, I've seen God be so faithful in those moments. And I look down at that scar now and I'm like, that was really hard. I know I said this a little earlier. That was one of the hardest times in my life, but God got me through it. Like we see in the Bible, how they make these, stack all the stones as a reminder of what God has done. Scars are a reminder
Yes.
of what God has done and how there's resurrection life after the death, after the grief, after the pain, after the sorrow. There is life, there is beauty, and there's glory. And so I have seen, even just looking down, it's a reminder like, this is a reminder that God is faithful and his glory is shining through, his goodness is shining through in this situation. I just look at my boy. I think as a mom, we have really hard times, seasons, days, but then we see our children and we're like, it's all worth it, and being able to show my kids, even through the scar, like God will help mommy through this and he will help you through anything that you're going to go through. Even if you feel like you can't do it, even if you feel weak, God is your strength. The joy of the Lord is your strength. So it's a visual reminder to me, and then I can pass that on to my children. So that's a beautiful way that God has redeemed this story and is continuing to redeem it.
Well, and the fact that you can share with other women who have gone through that, that is so consistent with scripture to comfort others with the comfort that God has given us. That is a
Mhm.
beautiful example of how God can redeem our most painful experiences. But I love that he's using those scars and redeeming them within your own household, because they
Mhm.
are an example then that you can teach your boys while they are young to build their faith, so that when they go through painful trials, when they are wounded, they know where their strength will come from. It's
Yeah.
beautiful. If a listener is resonating with our conversation today, whether they have a similar birth story as yours, or whether it's just they've gone through stuff in life that just did not go according to their plan, Becky, what hope-filled perspective would you want to leave them with today?
Well, this is another one of my sons, my youngest son's birth story, and I'm not going to tell it, but in the midst of it, God sent a rainbow because again, my labor had stalled, and I thought, oh no, am I going to have to have another C-section? And he sent a rainbow. And I have a real special affinity with rainbows in my life. And as I was writing this book, I learned something about rainbows that I never knew before that gives hope. And that is that they are not arches. They're actually full circles that can only be seen from a higher perspective. So when we think about that, on earth, we see the rainbow, which is God's promises, right? That he's going to keep his covenant with us as his children because he loves us. But we only see the arch.
Right.
We only see part of the promise sometimes, but that does not mean that the full promise isn't there. God sees the whole thing, and it's a circle, which is so cool because that's eternal. It doesn't end. It keeps going. His promises cannot be broken. And so that gives me hope when I think about how a rainbow is a symbol of God keeping his promises. And we know that he's going to be faithful, even if we can't see it in our hard circumstances. We only see a partial piece of the promise. He's going to bring it about. It is still there. So I hope that that can encourage some people, that you can have hope that those promises are going to come true.
Mhm. But I love how you relate to the fact that we can't always see that
Yeah.
when we're in the midst of a wound.
Mhm.
Before that wound has healed into a sacred scar, sometimes it's really hard for us to make sense of what good could come from this situation. How will I
Yeah.
get through this situation? How is God going to show up for me in this situation? Yet his promises are true, and it's up to us to trust and believe even before we see that beautiful sacred scar. Becky, thank you for sharing a painful experience that you've gone through, but also the beautiful redemptive sacred scar that God has brought through it. If a listener is wanting to connect with you, find out more about you, find out about your fabulous book, what's the best place for them to reach you?
Yeah, so people can just connect with me on my website. I think that's best, beckyberesford.com. Signing up to be part of my email list is probably the best. My empowered email tribe is what I call them. And I actually have a prayer journal that I made to go alongside with the book that people can sign up to receive. And then the book can be found anywhere books are bought. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook.
You are going to want to pick up a copy of Becky's book. It's good. You know that I don't endorse just anything that comes across my desk, but this is an encouraging word that when we can't, God can.
Mm.
And it's a matter of trusting Him, surrendering our will and our way to see how God will bring it forth. Friends, I hope that you are enjoying the Sacred Scar Story series as much as I am. Each story holds a nugget of hope. Our stories may not be the same as my guests, but there's always a spiritual, biblical, hope-filled perspective that we can hold on to. So it's my hope that there was something in today's conversation that has encouraged you. And if you know a friend who's going through a difficult time and maybe life isn't going the way they had planned or hoped it would you consider sharing this episode with them to encourage them in their walk as well? And while you're at it, consider picking up a copy of Sacred Scars, resting in God's promise that your past is not wasted. Until we're together again next week, my friend, it's my prayer for you that you will experience a hope-filled week.